Conference room went completely silent the moment my father walked through the door. He wasn't supposed to be there. Nobody had invited him. And yet there he was, standing at the entrance of the Meridian Group's annual investor dinner in his good navy blazer, the one he'd worn to my college graduation 12 years ago, holding a manila envelope like it was the most natural thing in the world. My husband's hand tightened around my arm, not affectionately, the way he always gripped me when he wanted me to stay still and stay quiet. I stayed still, but I wasn't quiet anymore. Not inside. Let me go back to the beginning because I want you to understand something. I wasn't naive. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't some girl who didn't know her own worth. I was 31 years old when I married my husband, and I had a master's degree in structural engineering from Georgia Tech, a job I was genuinely good at, and a father who had built a regional construction firm from nothing. 2 trucks and a handshake deal in 1987 turned into a $43 million company by the time I was in high school. I knew exactly who I was. What I didn't know was how quietly that knowledge could be taken from you. Not in one big dramatic moment. In 100 small ones. The first time my husband corrected me in public, we'd been married 4 months. We were at dinner with his colleagues, and I mentioned a project I'd been working on, a mixed-use development in Midtown Atlanta. I was proud of it. I'd spent 9 months on the load calculations alone. She tends to oversimplify when she explains technical things, he said, cutting me off mid-sentence. He smiled when he said it. His colleagues laughed. I told myself it was a joke. I told myself he was nervous around his work friends, and it came out wrong. I told myself a lot of things that year. By our 2nd anniversary, I had stopped mentioning my work at dinner parties altogether. By our 3rd, I had started second-guessing my own instincts at the office. By our 5th, I had taken a step down from project lead to support engineer because he'd suggested, very reasonably, that the stress of leadership wasn't good for me, that I seemed overwhelmed, that maybe I needed to focus on our home life for a while. He said it so gently. He said it so many times that I started to believe the premise, that I was struggling, that I was barely holding on, that without him managing things I would fall apart entirely. None of that was true. But when someone tells you a story about yourself every single day for 5 years, it starts to feel like memory. His mother was worse in her own way. She was the kind of woman who smiled while she said things that were designed to leave a mark. At every family gathering, she would find a way to mention my family background. My father's blue-collar roots. The fact that I'd grown up in a 3-bedroom house in Marietta. The fact that my mother drove a used Camry. She never said anything overtly cruel. She just framed everything about me as a deficit, a limitation, a thing her son had graciously overlooked. "We just want the best for him," she told me once, while handing me a dish to dry. I'm sure you understand. I understood perfectly. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone, was that 6 months earlier I had quietly enrolled in an online architecture licensing program through a university partnership, taking classes at 5 in the morning before my husband woke up, studying during my lunch breaks, submitting coursework from my car in the parking garage at work because I didn't want to explain myself to anyone until I had something real to show. I didn't know exactly what I was building toward. I just knew I needed to be building something. Anything. Something that belonged entirely to me. The thing about my father is that he and I hadn't spoken in 2 years by the time of that dinner. It wasn't a dramatic falling out. It was the kind of slow erosion that happens when someone you love starts believing the version of you that your spouse has been selling. My husband had worked on my father quietly and systematically, mentioning offhand that my father's advice was outdated, that his business instincts were risky, that his involvement in my life was making it harder for me to grow up. He said it out of concern, always out of concern. By the time I realized what had happened, the distance between my father and me had calcified into something that felt permanent. We exchanged texts on holidays. We didn't talk about anything real. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my father had never stopped watching. Not from a distance. From close up, he still knew people in the industry. He still asked questions. And over the course of 2 years, very quietly, he had been listening to things my husband had been saying about me to other people. Things about my competence, my stability, my value as a professional. Things that explained a lot about why certain doors had started closing without explanation. I found out all of this later, at the Meridian dinner, with 200 people watching. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The invitation to the Meridian Group investor dinner had come through my husband's firm. He was a senior partner at a commercial real estate development company, and Meridian was one of their biggest backers. It was the kind of event where deals got made and reputations got cemented, and my husband had made it very clear that my role for the evening was ornamental. "Just smile and don't talk too much about technical stuff," he said in the car on the way there. "These are finance people. They don't want to hear about load-bearing walls." I looked out the window and said nothing. I had, at that point, just passed my architecture licensing exam. I had also, 6 weeks prior, been approached by a former professor about a small firm she was launching. 3 partners, boutique commercial projects. Exactly the kind of work I'd gone into the field to do. She'd heard my name from someone. She wanted to know if I was interested. I hadn't told my husband. I was still deciding. I was still, even then, in the habit of waiting for permission. I was never actually going to give myself. The dinner was held on the 42nd floor of a building in Buckhead. Floor-to-ceiling windows downtown Atlanta spread out below, the kind of event where everyone is performing a version of themselves that costs money to maintain. I stood beside my husband for the first hour, holding a glass of sparkling water, smiling at the right moments, deflecting questions about what I did with a vague, "I'm in engineering," that I'd learned discouraged follow-up. His mother was there. She always appeared at these things, though she had no professional reason to. She positioned herself as a kind of social asset for my husband's firm, someone who knew everyone and could work a room. She found me near the bar during cocktail hour and made a point of introducing me to a group of Meridian board members as my son's wife, without saying my name. I smiled. I shook hands. I moved on. What I didn't realize was that one of those board members, a woman named Dr. Purcell Ellsworth, who ran Meridian's infrastructure investment portfolio, had looked me up after that introduction. She'd found my publications from grad school. She'd found the project documentation from the Midtown development I'd led. She'd had a conversation with someone at my old firm who told her, without any ambiguity, that I was the most technically capable person on the team, and that losing me to a step-down had been a genuine loss. None of this was visible to me from across the room. I was just trying to get through the evening without saying anything that would give my husband something to correct me about later. Then the doors opened and my father walked in. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I just hadn't let myself really look at him in a long time. He was wearing the navy blazer, and he walked with the same deliberate steadiness he'd always had. The walk of a man who built things for a living, who knew the weight of materials, who didn't move faster than the situation required. My husband saw him first. I felt the grip on my arm before I registered the figure in the doorway. "Why is he here?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know," I said. Which was true. My father's eyes found mine across the room. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just held my gaze for a moment, the way he used to when I was a kid and I'd done something I was ashamed of. Not with anger, but with a kind of patient acknowledgement. "I see you. I'm here. We'll sort this out." I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that look until it hit me like a physical thing in the middle of a 42nd floor investor dinner. My husband was already moving. He crossed the room with a kind of controlled urgency that looked like friendliness if you didn't know him well, intercepting my father near the entrance, speaking quietly, gesturing toward the door. My father listened. He nodded. He let himself be guided partially toward the edge of the room. And then he stopped. "I'm actually here to see Dr. Ellsworth," my father said, loudly enough that the people nearby could hear. "We have a meeting." My husband's composure didn't crack. It never cracked in public. "I'm not sure this is the right time for." "She invited me," my father said simply. He held up his phone. An email confirmation. "We've been talking for about 3 weeks. I didn't understand what was happening. I watched my husband's jaw tighten. I watched him glance across the room toward his mother, who had gone very still. Dr. Trum. Ellsworth appeared at my father's side then. She'd been watching from the moment he arrived. She shook his hand warmly and said, "Harold, I'm so glad you could make it." And the way she said it was the way you greet someone you've been genuinely looking forward to meeting. She turned to my husband with the polite, impenetrable smile of someone who holds all the cards. "Your father-in-law's firm has an extraordinary track record," she said pleasantly. "I've been doing some research." We had quite a lot to talk about. My husband said something appropriate. I don't remember what. I was watching my father, who was now looking at me again with that same steady expression. He reached into his jacket and took out the manila envelope. What happened in the next 20 minutes is something I've replayed more times than I can count. My father hadn't just come to the dinner to reconnect with me. He'd come because Dr. Ellsworth had, in the course of her research, discovered something. She'd found a paper trail, not difficult to find apparently for someone who knew where to look, of communications my husband had sent to colleagues, to former employers of mine, to people in the Atlanta development community, emails, a few texts that had been screenshotted and forwarded, references given that were technically accurate but strategically framed to raise doubts, the kind of quiet professional sabotage that's nearly impossible to prove in isolation, but looks very clear when you see it all together. My father had been collecting it for 18 months. He hadn't told me because he hadn't known how to tell me. Because every time he tried to raise concerns in the early years of my marriage, my husband had found ways to make those conversations into evidence of my father's interference, his outdated attitudes, his inability to let go. And I had believed it. I had chosen my husband's version of my father over my father himself. That was the part I had to sit with later, alone, and I won't pretend it was easy. But that night, in the Meridian Group dining room, with the Atlanta skyline behind us and 200 people who had come to make deals, my father handed the envelope to Dr. Ellsworth. She had already seen the contents. They had gone through it together over the past 3 weeks. This was the formality of it, the public record. She addressed the room. She didn't humiliate anyone for sport. That's not what this was. She simply stated, clearly and professionally, that in the course of due diligence on a proposed partnership with my husband's firm, certain conduct had come to light that the Meridian Group found inconsistent with their values around professional integrity. She mentioned no specific names in her initial remarks, though everyone in the room understood who she was talking about. She then said that she had become aware of an engineering professional whose qualifications she found genuinely impressive, whose work on the Midtown Atlanta development had been foundational to its success, and who had been systematically excluded from advancement in ways she found troubling. She said my full name. I remember the feeling of hearing it said clearly, in public, as a professional, not as someone's wife, not as a +1, not as a deficit to be graciously overlooked, just my name and my work, and a direct statement that both were worth taking seriously. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something real is happening. My husband started to speak. His mother put her hand on his arm, the same gesture he'd used on me so many times, and he stopped. I won't tell you I was perfectly composed. I wasn't. I found the nearest chair and sat down and stared at the skyline for a few minutes, while my father came and sat beside me, and for a long time neither of us said anything. He put his hand on top of mine the way he used to when I was small and had scraped my knee and was trying not to cry. I should have said something sooner, he said. I wouldn't have listened, I said, which was true and which cost me something to admit. No, he said, probably not. He was quiet for a moment. But I should have kept trying. We sat there while the dinner carried on around us in a muted, rearranged way, conversations relocated, alliances quietly recalibrated, the social geometry of the room shifting without any official announcement. My husband left with his mother. I heard about it later from someone who'd been standing near the exit. No scene, no confrontation, just a departure, quiet and inevitable, like air going out of something that had been holding a shape it was never meant to hold. The months that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that. Leaving a marriage, even a bad one, even one that has been slowly dismantling you for years, is not a clean process. There are lawyers and paperwork and the specific grief of realizing that the version of your life you thought you were building doesn't exist and never did. There are mornings where you wake up in a quiet apartment and don't know, for a moment, whether the quiet is freedom or loss. Most mornings, it was both. I joined my former professor's firm 4 months after the dinner. 3 partners, 11 employees, a client list that was modest but serious. I took on a mixed-use commercial project in the Virginia Highland neighborhood. Not the biggest contract we landed that year, but the one where I spent the most time on the structural details, the one where I left the office at midnight because I wanted to. Not because someone was waiting to evaluate my choices when I got home. The Meridian Group became one of our first institutional investors. Dr. Ellsworth sat on our advisory board. She had an eye for overlooked talent. She'd said so at the dinner, and she meant it. My father retired from his firm the following spring and sold his stake to a regional consortium for a figure that would have made the people who'd underestimated him in 1987 very quiet. He came to visit me in Atlanta that summer, and we spent 3 days together doing nothing in particular. Going to the farmer's market, watching baseball, talking for hours the way we used to when I was in high school and thought my father knew everything. He still knows a lot, as it turns out. There's a woman on our team, named Felicity, who has been with us since the beginning. She'd been let go from a larger firm in a round of cuts that, in retrospect, had less to do with her performance than with the politics of who advocated for whom. She runs our client relations now. She is meticulous and loyal, and the first person in the office every morning, and when we celebrated our first full year in business, I made sure she was standing next to me in the photograph. Some people ask me if I regret staying as long as I did. I've thought about that a lot. The honest answer is complicated. I don't think I could have left before I was ready, and I wasn't ready until I had rebuilt enough of myself to believe there was something worth leaving for. The architecture license, the early morning study sessions, the slow reconstruction of confidence in my own judgment. That wasn't wasted time. That was the foundation. I just wish I'd poured it sooner. The last time I drove past the building where the Meridian dinner was held, I was on my way to a site visit for a project we're bidding on, a civic center in Decatur, the kind of commission that would have been out of reach for us 2 years ago. I was in the car my father had given me after the divorce, a practical sedan with good sight lines and a trunk big enough for rolled drawings. Not a flashy car, just a good one. One that gets me where I'm going. I looked up at the 42nd floor as I passed, and I thought about the woman who'd stood there holding a glass of sparkling water, waiting for the evening to be over, editing herself in real time, making herself smaller by increments so small she'd stop noticing. I thought, I know what she needed to hear, and I'm still learning how to say it in time. The light changed. I drove on. I used to think that staying quiet was the same as giving up. I know now it wasn't. It was the only condition under which I could actually hear myself think. There's a version of the story where I confront my husband early, where I make a scene at one of those dinners, where I demand to be seen before I've done the work of seeing myself clearly. I've imagined that version. It feels satisfying for about 10 seconds, and then it falls apart. Because the truth is, I wasn't ready. I didn't have the ground under me yet. And no amount of righteous anger changes the fact that you can't build anything on a foundation you haven't laid. What I did instead, the early mornings, the parking garage study sessions, the slow reconstruction of my own judgment, that wasn't patience as a virtue, it was necessity. It was the only honest thing I knew how to do. And looking back, I think that's what my father understood long before I did. He didn't come to that dinner to rescue me. He came because I had already rescued myself, and someone needed to bear witness to it. The thing about my husband's behavior, the corrections, the quiet sabotage, the emails I didn't know about until my father handed that envelope to Dr. Tomtier. Ellsworth, is that it only worked because I let the story he was telling about me go unanswered for so long. Not unchallenged. Unanswered. There's a difference. Challenging him out loud would have cost me everything before I had anything to replace it with. Answering him in the only language that actually matters. Work, credentials, results, the slow accumulation of proof. That took longer, but it held. That's the part I want people to understand. Intelligence isn't just what you know. It's knowing when to use what you know and when to keep building instead. I had the technical skills. I had the education. What took me longer to develop was the judgment to trust my own read of a situation over the version someone else was selling me. That kind of clarity doesn't come from a degree. It comes from enough mornings alone with your own thoughts that you stop being able to lie to yourself about what you're actually seeing. And the integrity piece, that one is harder to talk about because it means admitting where I fell short too. I let distance grow between my father and me because I chose comfort over honesty. I chose my husband's version of events because it was easier than sitting with doubt. That cost both of us 2 years we don't get back. The price of that choice wasn't abstract, it was real, and it was mine to carry. Felicity was in my office last week, going over the Decatur proposal. She stayed 2 hours past the end of the day because she wanted the numbers to be right. Nobody asked her to. She just did it, the way she always does, because she's the kind of person who shows up fully or not at all. I think about that a lot. About what it means to be that kind of person. To keep showing up, especially when nobody's watching, especially when the people who should be in your corner aren't. That's not stubbornness. That's something quieter and more durable. The decision, made over and over in small moments, to keep being someone you can respect. The light changed. I drove on. And that was enough.